Better Buildings for Humans is powered by Advanced Glazings, makers of the Solera line of products. Solera is the leading glass glazing made specifically for architectural daylighting and with extreme insulation performance. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Better Buildings for Humans. This is the podcast where we look at the impact that the built environment has on our health, our wellness, our productivity, and our general joy of being alive. And of course, in order to do that, we have to talk about sustainability as well. And today we're going to explore the artistic side of sustainability and great building design. I am very fortunate to have Eliza Redmann with us today. Eliza, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, I'm really excited. As I spoke briefly before we started recording, and I said I get a lot of scientists on the show, and we get into some hardcore nerding out, which I absolutely love. But I really like exploring the artistic side of buildings and construction and design as well. And today we get to do that. We're going to talk about Eliza's company, Folded Poetry. So, Eliza, give us a little bit about your background, how you chose architecture, and then I'd like to hear the story that led you to the creation of Folded Poetry. I understand, the creation was driven by some trauma. It's informed a lot of what you do. And let's hear that story so that people can understand, how we ended up here.
Yes, it's a really good question how I made this transition from being a full-time architect to a full-time sculptural artist. But I want to answer your first question first, which was why I chose architecture. I originally am from Minnesota, and I went to undergraduate school in Minnesota at a small college called St. John's University. And when I was there, I was actually studying political science. And during my political science career, I took an environmental politics and policy class, and I started learning a lot about the energy use of buildings. And I was very sort of interested in pursuing more of a policy-oriented career. And I was kind of deciding between that or maybe environmental law, something in that department. Well, as I was taking this class at the same time, I was also working as a gallery assistant in the campus's art gallery. And through that process, I was recreating spaces over and over again with these exhibits. So as artists would come in, we would just reinvent the space and just do that over and over again. And I just got to thinking, there's this crossover between the sustainability aspect of buildings and, the art aspect. And I think it lives in architecture. And I think this could be the career for me. Now, at that point, I was already well over halfway through my degree in political science. And so I needed to kind of pivot and decide to go back to graduate school after my undergraduate degree and pursue architecture. And I decided to do that at North Carolina State University, their College of Design, which is an excellent school. And so I took one gap year and then I moved down to Raleigh, North Carolina, and I did my master's in architecture, the Track 3 program for people who have an unrelated undergraduate degree between 2013 and 2016. And then I moved after that to a nearby city called Durham, North Carolina, which is where I still currently live. And I began working at a very reputable local architecture firm. And I was, during that time, bought a home at a really good time. And I also was biking to and from work every day. And I was pursuing my architecture licensure during that time as well. And I had this really thriving social life, or mostly around the biking scene. I was really into the sustainability aspect of the architecture of the buildings that I was working on. I was actually working on a student union building at Emory University and was working very closely with the sustainability consultant on that project. Very interesting time for me. Well, then, unfortunately, in 2018, I was driving to an intramural soccer match down the street from my home, and I was hit head on by a vehicle coming the opposite way on the road. I was going through a green light, and they just came through the intersection and assumed they had the right of way. I'm not sure exactly what they were thinking, but they hit me head on. I suffered a massive traumatic brain injury and a neck injury in that moment. And it was like my life just completely changed in that moment. I didn't really know it at the time, how much everything would change for me. But I was immediately taken via ambulance to the nearby hospital at Duke and saw their neurology department and the ER, and I found that I had a subdural hematoma, which is an internal bleed. It was a very substantial one on the left side of my brain. And I also had this neck injury that was really nagging me. And I spent the night in the ICU and was discharged the next day, and it was, okay, you're going to be good. Everything's good, right? And it just life did not go back to normal the way I expected it to. I found myself really struggling for a very long time after the traumatic brain injury. We decided not to operate to take the blood out, which maybe would have helped me, maybe not, we're not sure. And so it just was a very prolonged recovery. And during that time, I was really struggling to take care of myself and was really experiencing a lot of overstimulation. Like if I'm trying to read on the computer during that time, I have maybe 5 to 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes where I can stay focused and actually my eyes can track what I'm doing before I start to get hot, before I start to get nauseous, before I start to get overwhelmed. And it's like, I have got to lay down. Like this is just too much for me. Even just getting to the grocery store and getting my groceries, like that level of executive functioning of like meal planning and going and, deciding on which product to get and getting out of the store without feeling completely overwhelmed. Like I was at that level of disability after my traumatic brain injury, which of course is like very difficult as a 28-year-old going from having everything, the career, the life laid out ahead of me, ready to move on into my full career as a licensed architect, and had this, like I mentioned, the social life and biking everywhere, being very active. And it just sort of went from 100 to like -10 very quickly. And I was already feeling quite isolated during that time as I was trying to recover. And then, of course, a year and a half into that process of trying to heal, COVID hits and we all go into this lockdown. And it's like, okay, this is not looking good for me. Like I've got to figure something out here to show up for myself. So amongst many of the other symptoms I was experiencing from the brain injury, some of the most disturbing ones were, difficulty executive functioning, difficulty with reading and doing screen time, some balance issues, and also just feeling very like overwhelmed in the spaces that I used to be able to spend a lot of time in. The city that I live in, Durham, North Carolina, there's a ton of old tobacco warehouses here. It's very much in the South, proper South. And the downtown is all these old tobacco warehouses that have been renovated. And while it's this wonderful brick and wood aesthetic, it is extremely difficult for people like me who struggle with feeling overwhelmed with loud noises and spaces just being the volume just being too high in spaces.
Right.
And so that immediately had like an accessibility barrier to those spaces downtown. And that was a really difficult piece of all of this as well. Before I go on, do you have any questions?
Oh, no, please keep talking. This is,
okay.
Yeah, I'm riveted here.
Okay. Good. So COVID hits and I'm realizing, okay, I need to find a way to show up for myself. And I think it was also my aunt who lives nearby who just challenged me. She said, Eliza, you need to have a renaissance moment here. You need to find a way to reinvent yourself and be creative here. And that's kind of what I thought. I said, I have this disability I'm working through. I'm slowly getting better at like a snail's pace, but it's not at all the pace in which I want to be improving. I kept trying to go back to architecture and it was literally like hitting my head against a wall and reeling back and then trying to do it again. And it just was that type of thing. And I just had to sit back and just say, you know what? That is not my path anymore. I keep trying to go back. I cannot go back. I need to go forward. I need to find another path that will take me forward. And the question that came to my mind is, well, aren't I still a creative person? I can still create. I have this skill set where I can use my hands. So why don't I just lean into that? And so one day I just went to the basement of my home and I hopped into SketchUp, which is a program I still use primarily for most of my designs. And I knew that I had about 10 to 15 minutes in this program before I'm starting to feel nauseous. I'm starting to feel hot. I'm starting to sweat. And so I just had this idea for design, which is just a really simple geometric shape with a off-centered center point. And it was just a diamond shape. And I sketched in my sketchbook and I went in and I said, let's just make this. So I started modeling it in SketchUp. And in about 15 minutes, I had the shape and I was able to unfold it. And from there, I printed it out in my printer at home and I hand cut it. And I hand cut multiples of them. And I assembled my first, what was then at the time, and I didn't know it, was my first ever paper artwork through Folded Poetry, which would soon become my brand name. And I produced it and I thought, well, I don't even know what this is, but I like it. And so I took a directional light and I moved it across this piece and it made this really interesting, perplexing visual phenomenon. It made the design really come to life in a way that was super engaging. And I posted these onto my Instagram page. And from there, I just got a bunch of feedback from everyone. I think everyone was kind of holding their breath, like waiting, like, is she going to make a recovery, or is this, was that the best? And I was asking myself this same question, like, was that the best of my life before this car crash, or is there more ahead of me? And so this was really the first step that I took to really show up for myself and start producing forward momentum for my life through my creativity. And so, after that piece, I started getting requests for commissions, and I started getting people who are reaching out. Oh, can you make me something? Here's my budget. And so I just said, well, I'm just going to do this. I'm still recovering. It was maybe 5 hours a week, maybe 10 hours a week, not much, as much as I could do based on how I was feeling at that time, and just started, selling these pieces and building a bit of a business. Now, during that time, what I noticed too is I wasn't fully aware of what my intentions were with this. And sometimes it's interesting that life works in that way. You set off in direction following your intuition. You don't always know exactly the why behind it. But what I discovered was I was actually creating these perplexing pieces of artwork that really bend the mind and were intentionally bringing people into my experience with traumatic brain injury, because I was saying, hey, this is what it looks like for me. This is what my visual disturbances are like. Now, I haven't mentioned this yet, but another symptom that I have dealt with since my traumatic brain injury, and I still deal with to this day, is often when I look at like brick walls or tile floors, or even if people are wearing like a shirt that has a very bold pattern on it and I'm sitting across the table from them, it can start to swim and move, and it can make me very disoriented. And again, the nausea coming on when I'm in those situations. And so what I figured out I was actually doing, and I realized I was doing, was I was actually giving people a glimpse into my experience with traumatic brain injury by creating these paper pieces of artwork. And I was also raising awareness for invisible disabilities through the art that I'm making. And since then, I have continued to grow my business. And, that essentially is the long story of how I transitioned from architecture into full-time sculptural artist.
Do you want to bring lots of healthy, beautiful, natural light in your building and still meet energy codes? Try Solera from Advanced Glazings. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. So you've got a really good understanding. I got to pause for a second. That's an incredible story, and I congratulate you. And, it's amazing that you were able to push through all of those difficulties. Heck, I dislocated my shoulder in February, and I've been bitching about it to anybody who would listen, and I feel like such a baby now. So
I get it. No, those chronic pain injuries are so difficult. And they're invisible. That's the thing. It's invisible. Illustrating is that you're walking around with this, this disability or this experience of pain. And it's just like no one else can see it. No one else can understand. And that can be very isolating.
So you've learned a lot because of this experience of how significantly architecture can impact, neurological health, sensory health. I mean, architecture is just really getting into the world of neuroscience now and truly understanding how it impacts us. How does it influence your creations now that you know just how significant the subtleties of architecture can impact people who have any sort of sensory health related issues?
Right. So before I dive into more of like the form and function of what I've began doing, I also just want to mention on this podcast, Better Buildings for Humans, that, something I realized far too late in this process of recovery was that I was recovering full time in my home, and my home actually had a mold problem. And so I was trying to recover from my traumatic brain injury in a space that had contamination with something that is well known to have neurological implications. And so it was, there were a lot of different factors going on here that were kind of inhibiting my recovery. And it's really just been like a continuous in lockstep. Like my business continues to grow, I continue to heal, and I find solutions and that type of thing. Now, to your question around architecture. So I mentioned earlier that I was really struggling with feeling like these spaces that I used to spend time in, and most spaces, quite frankly, that I go out to still have a lot of uncontrolled noise. And that became something that very quickly went to the high priority level on my radar in terms of like my design practice. And as I was making these modular shapes that were driven by my 10 to 15 minutes, what I realized is that when I'm able to compile these, it's kind of hard to describe exactly what I'm talking about. If you're listening to this, I encourage you to take a look at my work so that you can kind of understand what I mean when I say directionally scattered surfaces. So these surfaces are refract. I was thinking, this is a very interesting design that if it were paired with, that already functions very well to refract noise and scatter noise waves. Now, that combined with a noise absorptive material, we could have a really viable acoustic product here. And so I began experimenting not only with form, but also the function of my work at a very early point in my career, where in the studio, I started cladding my pieces with this velvet flocking material. And I started trying to get my hands on more acoustic felt material to do design work with. And I eventually, and all of this is out of the motivation to experiment with this idea of making spaces more accessible for people like me. So how can I solve my own problem? But how can I solve the problem of a lot of people who struggle with this same phenomenon? And essentially what happened was I began to compile these designs and really build a body of work that was around this idea of acoustic artwork, functional artwork. And I compiled it into my email newsletter, which I'd encourage everyone to sign up for after this. And I sent it out to my community.
Can we pause for just a second?
Yes,
because you mentioned asking people to check out your work and your newsletter. Can you just tell us the website and share that information? So right now, while people are excited about it, sorry to interrupt you, but let's get that information out.
Yes, I love that question. Thank you so much for that. So my website is foldedpoetry.com. FOLDED poetry.com. That's where you can find my work. I'm also on Instagram at Folded Poetry and TikTok is at Folded Poetry. And I'm also on LinkedIn at Eliza Redmann.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to interrupt, but we needed that.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, if you go on the website right now, what I would encourage you to take a look at is my paper artwork. Those are my kind of earliest works. And also the acoustic product line, which was released last fall, which I'm about to tell you kind of the backstory on. So you can kind of follow along with what I'm talking about. So basically, at this time, I'm experimenting with these acoustic artwork shapes, and I send it out to my community via my email newsletter, which you can sign up for at the bottom of my website homepage. And someone in my newsletter who I met at a networking event 6 months earlier said, wow, this is great. And she forwarded it to this company called UnikaVev. And they reached out back in response and said, let's meet up. Let's talk about this. It seems like you have a really great feel for creating designs that could function very well acoustically. And, probably about 2 years ago. And then all of last year, we were collaborating on our first acoustic product line, which was released last fall. So the product line is literally called Folded Poetry. It's my brand name in a product line. And it is a grouping of my earliest designs. So my earliest, most basic designs that I created. It is this idea that we can take, this hexagon, this diamond, and this triangle, and we can combine them in different ways to make these really mind-bending acoustic artwork pieces that, like I said, with my paper pieces that evoke the visual disturbances and represent what it's like to experience traumatic brain injury, and also allow for noise reduction and to address some of the fallout from the brain injury and also what a lot of other people experience. Now, as I've been putting my work out there with this acoustic artwork, so many people have reached out to me and said, thank you for doing this. I'm neurodivergent and I really struggle in these spaces, or I have a lot of anxiety and it makes me very anxious to be in these spaces when it's so loud and I can't hear what's going on around me. Or my mother is dealing with Alzheimer's and I can't take her out to these spaces anymore because it's just too loud. So in this way, my brand has sort of gone through these phases, and the most current phase and the most current mission that I'm on is to raise awareness for these invisible disabilities through both the aesthetic and the function of my work.
Oh, this is incredible. Okay, so we're going to come back to UnikaVev in just a minute, but I want to expand on two terms that you sort of used there, two terms that you used there, and I want to broaden them a little bit. It's very obvious what they mean after hearing your story, but let's broaden them a little bit. And the first one is sensory accessibility. Can you define that in a broader sense for us, Eliza?
Yeah, that's a great question. So sensory accessibility to me means that you are able to spend time in a space without feeling overwhelmed just on account of, the surfaces and the finishes that are in the space. And for me, the visual and audio experience. If there is an overstimulation factor, that is something that inhibits sensory accessibility.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So all the noise and maybe really bold patterns, those sorts of things literally create a barrier.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
can. Or really, I would say for me, like, complex bold pattern, it's not to say to stray away from bright colors. I think there's research that indicates that can be very stimulating in a positive way.
Right.
Another thing to consider also, for me is like, I think like flashing lights too. Like if a light is flickering in a space, like it can just be like, oh my gosh, I cannot focus if
Yeah.
that light is flickering. So things like that to think about. Generally, I like to think of accessible spaces as like ones that have a lot of softness. So ones that have like, it's the experience of hearing the space. There's not a lot of echoing. There's not a lot of reverberation. There's plenty of soft spaces. The noise is soft. The lighting is soft. It's not super harsh, blue light overhead all the time. We have more soft lighting and softness in these ways in the interior of these buildings.
I'm going way off script with this one, but is there a group where you can have discussions with other people who have, sensory sensitivities?
I don't have that network right now, but I would
Okay.
love it.
Okay. I was just curious.
I
Yeah.
don't have a group necessarily. These are all really like, you know, I think a value that I bring to people's lives through my brand is like just the vulnerability of sharing openly about what I've been through,
Right.
which makes it that people feel that they can really confide in me as well. And so a lot of what I've shared around people coming to me and saying, I struggle with this or my family member struggles with this, these are all like individual interactions that I have with people where they are coming to me individually or they're reaching out to me via email and saying, my daughter struggles with this type of thing. And thank you for doing what you're doing. So
Gotcha.
I think that there is like a real like vulnerability aspect to these things, mostly because of what we just discussed earlier, where they're totally invisible and people don't see them. And so it's very easy to feel like alienated or like you're the only one struggling with this type of thing. And I think that it would be great to have a group just so that people know that you're not alone, that a lot of people out there walk around with these invisible things going on, invisible disabilities. And it's important that, you don't feel that way.
Right. Oh, fantastic. The other term that I wanted to talk about, and it's sort of self-defining, but I want to hear you talk about it, is the term functional art. How would you define that, Eliza?
Yes, for me, the functional art aspect is something that has multi-purposes. And so I have a little bit of like mixed feelings around like, you know, proclaiming the values of functional art because I don't inherently think that art needs to have a function to be valuable. Art in itself can just be, just art, and that in
Mhm.
itself is valuable. But my take on it is kind of double dipping. So when I was working full time as a young architect, I was looking for the products that now I am creating. I was out there looking for the very visually interesting products, the ones that really can have dual function as this art and acoustic value. And I just felt like I wasn't able to really find it. We just had options that were I thought were just kind of boring options. And I felt that they were also very expensive, boring options. And so that's something that when I think about functional art, I immediately, of course, my mind goes to this acoustic aspect. But functional art could be something that includes like lighting as well. These things, creating super artistic lighting fixtures, or, there are other ways to create functional art as well, where it serves both this aesthetic and like this purpose of doing something within a building. Yeah, I had a thought come and I lost it. So I'm going to see if I can remember and come back to it.
All right. Yeah, absolutely. Just bring it back at any time if it pops
Oh,
into
I
your
just
head.
did bring it back. Okay.
Perfect. Let's go.
Which is that, yes. Which is that, a lot of feedback that I've been getting from like interior designers on this acoustic product is that they really like that it has this dual function, because when we think about budgeting for buildings, we usually have an art budget and we have an acoustic budget. And what this product line does, and what Folded Poetry, the acoustic product line does, and the other products that I'm in the mix with developing right now, is they do this crossover where it's like, this is art and it's acoustic. And so it makes it easier for like interior designers to spec it, because it's something that covers both budget boxes or checks both budget boxes.
I just had an idea pop into my head, and it's just completely way off script, Eliza, so forgive me, but I just need to know the answer to this. It seems like paper would be somewhat easily damaged. Is that an issue at all in your work, that you worry about somebody, destroying, be it accidentally or through vandalism, destroying these wonderful things that you're creating?
Well, I should say that when the acoustic product that I have out right now is made from acoustic felt, and it's very durable.
Okay.
But in terms of like my artwork, so I work with individuals for individual commissions, and I work with art agencies, and I work with interior designers to make just paper artwork too.
Yeah.
And to answer your question with regarding the durability aspect, it's really interesting. Like, you're an engineer. And so the very interesting aspect about the paper pieces is that because they are folded, it adds structure. So the seams and the bends, it adds this structure. So sometimes I can like even rest things on top of these pieces, depending on how they're made. And they're pretty durable. I mean, obviously I wouldn't be able to withstand someone literally like punching through the piece or like intentionally trying to damage it. But
Right.
I'm always surprised by, bumping into something that I've made and, oh, it's actually fine. That happens a lot. So,
Right.
But in terms of the acoustic product, it's made from this acoustic felt that is extremely durable. I have a panel of this. It's called PET felt. It's made from recycled plastic bottles, which is wonderful because it covers the sustainability aspect that so many designers are looking for and that we all want to include in our work. But this plastic bottle-based acoustic felt, I've had a panel of it in the backyard of my property for about 2 years. And I just leave it out there in the North Carolina summer and winter. And I just am observing, what is happening with this material over time. And so far, it's just hanging out. Like, doesn't really need to be cleaned. It's just sort of, the cleaning too is very simple. And it's just doing great back there. So I've done my own little experiment with it too, to kind of answer this question as well.
Okay. I'm glad I asked. Let's go back to UnikaVev. They're out of Connecticut, right?
Yes.
Manufacturer. So what's your relationship? How does your relationship work? How does it function?
Yes, so the UnikaVev is the company that, someone referred me to from my newsletter with all of my acoustic art prototypes in it. And we explored this product line, the folded poetry product line. So really, we're a collaboration. I collaborate with them as a designer. So I come up with ideas and I create design proposals for them to incorporate and decide to move forward with they have a number of manufacturers that they work with around the world. And so they decide that, yes, we'd like to move forward with this particular designer. No, not so much. But I have so many ideas for, how these designs can become functional using this acoustic felt. So really, for me, it's about collaborating and working with their fabrication lead to determine what their capacity is, what their strengths are, what their limitations are, and then design products that fit within that capacity for them. So I love that this relationship with them was my first relationship working in a licensing capacity. So really what I do is design licensing. So I grant them the right to use these designs. I work with their fabrication partners to bring these designs to fruition. And then I receive a royalty of the sale off the top of the sale for this product. And so that's our relationship. We have a really wonderful relationship and I love working with them. And I've since been sort of branching out and kind of imagining, okay, what else can folded poetry do? We have this acoustic, this functional art piece. I'm certain there are other licensing opportunities with companies where they want to bring aesthetic value and they want to bring the accessibility and the disability awareness value to what they do and their product. And so I'm also actively looking for those opportunities as well.
Tired of ugly blinds blocking your view? Imagine solving glare and heat gain without fighting the blinds and without replacing your glass. Glare Repair by Solera is here. Learn more at advancedglazings.com/glare repair.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Fantastic. What's kind of cool about that is the whole idea of constrained art, right? Which is obviously a discussion we could have for hours and hours. But, your art is constrained by the manufacturing equipment and the manufacturing skills of the company. That leads into a whole other series of really interesting questions. Have you ever been really disappointed because you had something that you thought was a really great design that just could not be manufactured? Have you gone there yet?
That's a good question. I don't think I have really encountered that yet. I'm certain it will probably happen at some point. I hope it doesn't, but not yet on that regard.
Okay.
And I will say, I love that you brought up just the word constraint, because one of my design studio mottos is constraint breeds creativity. So having to create within a limited scope, having to design, for me, having to redesign my life within a limited scope, having to design artwork within a limited scope of 10 to 15 minutes on the computer for modules, which no no longer is the case, but definitely was when I was started. And it creates a simplicity, and it also forces you to think more creatively and forces you to think outside of the box. And I really love that aspect. And the same thing is true for working with fabrication partners and manufacturers, getting in there and saying, okay, you guys have the ability to do X and Y and Z, but not A, B, and C. Okay, let's see what we can do within there. And it really does breed this more creative thinking.
Right on. Let's go to the next one. I want to talk about the name Folded Poetry, which just automatically evokes this sense of narrative that's now being embedded into form, right? It's the ultimate conversion. Like, it's such a direct conversion from narrative to form. You could actually write the poetry on the paper that you're using as your raw material. Stories, though, right? What are the stories that you're trying to tell with your work?
Right. I love this question. So folded poetry in itself, it has this sort of like almost like a mystical essence about it, because it's like, oh, is the poem folded? Is it a metaphorical folding of poetry? What does poetry mean? It has so many different layers of things that it could mean. And it's a little bit different, and the interpretation is a little bit different for everyone. So for me, that is art. Everyone encounters it differently. And so in the name, it's like, what does it mean to you? There is this room for interpretation with the name folded poetry.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then, sorry, what was the other aspect of your question?
The stories, like, is there a particular narrative that you embed in your art?
Yes. And so bringing that aspect in, folded poetry, we have this kind of name that is a little bit mind bending. And that is also the story behind the artwork, is creating this sort of mind bending artwork that represents experience with traumatic brain injury. And then also by extension, more broadly. So folded poetry for me is about raising awareness for these invisible disabilities and giving people an opportunity to connect with me, connect with each other, and generally, give them the opportunity to be in spaces that they previously weren't able to be in. So really serving this population of underrepresented people who deal with these things is what the name means to me. And for me, it's really baked into the definition of the name too.
I love it. Yeah, the name itself is art. I love that. All right. I want to ask a question, and I'm sorry that I'm rushing a little bit, but I just want to make sure that we cover all of these things. This has probably been debated a million times, but I want to hear your take on it. Is there a line between sculpture and architecture? And if so, where is that line?
Oh, that's such a good question. So for me, I would say that, when I think about sculpture versus architecture, I think architecture is something that is occupiable. I don't see as much sculpture that is occupiable. And occupiable, I don't just mean like you can go in it. I mean like you can live in it, you can work in it, you can go shopping in it. So there's an actual, for lack of a better word, function to what you're going into the space to do. In a lot of ways, architecture is very sculptural. But I would say that's kind of the line for me. With sculpture, it's not something where you can occupy it necessarily, usually. I feel like as soon as you can occupy sculpture, then it becomes architecture.
Right. Love it. All right. So we've reached the point in the show where I have to ask my $1 million question. So there's a question I ask every single guest, and I ask them to answer it from whatever perspective they'd like. And here we go, Eliza. The question is, what makes a great building?
It's such a good question, too. So for me, what I consider to be a great building is one that gives me a specific feeling. For me, it's about the felt sense within the building, or when I encounter the building. Am I inspired by this building? When I see the building from the outside, does it tickle my, curiosity? And then as I move through the building, am I continually scanning and looking around and inspired by what I see, curious about what I see, trying to figure out how it comes together? Does it inspire curiosity? Does it inspire me to feel, am I comfortable in the space? Am I stimulated by this space in a good way? Do I want to spend more time in this space, or do I want to get out of this space? For me, those are the questions that help answer what makes a building great.
I love that. So reaction to it tells us the story of the greatness to the building. All right. Before we go, Eliza, do you have any exciting news that you'd like to share? Any big announcements or anything that you'd like to promote?
Yes, there's so many things I'm working on right now, but I think the one that I really want to highlight is I am working on a very wonderful mission-driven public art project right now. So the project itself is called the Stitching Stories Prison Awareness Quilt. So during COVID in North Carolina, women in the Canary unit in Raleigh started this project where they started crocheting to help themselves get through. The people who were incarcerated during COVID are people who suffered probably the most because they lost access to, already they have limited access, and they lost access to all of their loved ones during this time and so many other things, the ability to work on the outside of the incarceration facility. So these people who were incarcerated are, during that time started creating a prison awareness quilt. So they started crocheting squares for every year, one square for every year that they were incarcerated. And now this quilt, it has over 250, I'm sorry, I'm getting the number wrong. It has a lot of squares. Okay, I think it's around 700.
Okay.
I'm forgetting the exact number, 750 or something like that, individual squares. And they're all in these sections that represent, this is this woman's section of the quilt, and this is this woman's section of the quilt. And this public art project is commemorating that quilt into a permanent form. And so what we're doing is we're using architectural materials and sculptural materials we're using a high density foam backer and a mosaic. So I'm a co-lead on this project with the mosaic artist. And we are bringing this quilt to life so that it can, have a lasting legacy beyond which the actual physical quilt itself might live. And it's been this wonderful process of working with these formerly incarcerated women to hear their stories and involve them in the process of designing this exhibit, which is going to live in a shipping container that is going to travel around North Carolina and also potentially nationally as well, to share awareness for mass incarceration and to uplift the voices of these currently and formerly incarcerated women. So that's just a wonderful project that I'm working on, and just an example of, we talked a lot about the acoustic product and my paper art, but I also do these public art projects, and this is just one that is just so wonderful and such a joy to be a part of, and so mission driven. And I'm just really glad to share it with you. And unfortunately, I just checked in and their website is not up yet, but the project is called Stitching Stories, a Prison Awareness Quilt, and it will be live in probably less than 3 months. We're going to have this shipping container that's going to be traveling across North Carolina to these various locations.
Stitching Stories. And is there a website, or will there be a website soon?
There will be a website soon for it, yes.
Do you have a URL that you can share, Eliza?
I don't have it offhand, but I know what it will be, and I can share that with you.
You share it with me when you have it, and when we post your episode, when it goes live, we'll put it into the episode description.
Okay, that sounds wonderful.
All right. Eliza, thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation. I'm so glad we got to do this.
Yes, this was wonderful. Thank you so much. I had such a great time talking with you, and you had excellent questions. So I really appreciate the thought you put into preparing for this conversation, and I felt it went really well. So thank you.
Yeah, well, it's an honor to have you. So I wanted to make sure I did it right. So thank you very much.
Thank
Take care.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much, Joe.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Better Buildings for Humans. For more information on the world's best light diffusing and highly insulating glass glazing, please visit advancedglazings.com.